I am going to introduce the host for today's talk, who is Matthew Parrish. Matthew is he is in his last year at the Mays Business School, majoring in finance. He is the director of our research team. He's been with the center since as long as I can remember, and he's worked closely with Shouvik on AverPoint, and he will introduce the topic and tell you more about Shouvik. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Kurok. So yeah, on behalf of the Mays Innovation Research Center, we are very blessed to have Shouvik Banerjee attend us today. Shouvik is the founder and CEO of AverPoint, which is a credibility layer for digital content. The company's mission is to help honest creators and brands win more votes, sales, and influence. Shouvik previously worked at SolarCity, once the country's largest solar company, where he led product business development. He served in the Obama administration's first term, where he worked on the policy and implementation teams of the $80 billion clean energy package and the 2009 stimulus. He worked at McKinsey before that, where he focused on clean energy projects, including the firm's first electric vehicle study. He holds a BS in computer science from Stanford University, as well as a BA in American history, as well as a master's in public policy from Harvard University. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Shouvik Banerjee.
Hey, thank you so much, Matthew, and thanks everyone for joining, and really appreciate your time. So I was originally going to talk about social enterprise and innovation, and then the topic I work on, specifically disinformation, has always been very relevant in my eyes, but it got very relevant to all of us a few weeks ago. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you guys see the slides? Okay, great. So earlier this month, we all saw the storming of the US Capitol. Some people had guns, knives, a noose, a kill list. Some were, of course, fringe lunatics. But what really interests me is many were leaders in their communities. At least 16 elected officials, hundreds of military veterans, a 3-time Olympian, religious leaders, CEOs of profitable small businesses who had employees, many fathers, mothers, ordinary people. You may have read about Adam Newbold. He served as a Navy SEAL for over 20 years. He now runs 2 businesses in his hometown. He's the kind of guy normally you would make action movies about. He did missions in countries where disinformation had deceived large populations, but he is convinced the election was stolen. And in his mind, he was not leading an insurrection. He was saving America from a stolen election. Now, the claim of the stolen election originated from the president, who had made charges of voter fraud since 2012, when he first considered running for office, or actually not the first time, but when he was considering running for office. If you believed the election was stolen, you would also have over 10 senators, 100 congresspeople, many religious leaders, and an army of TV and talk radio commentators who validated the claim. A bloody storming of the Capitol was also in line with the prophecies of QAnon, which polls show 70% of Trump voters believe to some degree. Now, all of this made your belief in voter fraud and possibly violence seem reasonable, not insane. And if you believe this, what would happen if I spent today trying to prove you're wrong? That the voter fraud campaign was a multi-year disinformation campaign? What if I talked about Trump's past, when we have documents showing that he would trigger people's emotions to plant a message in their brain? What about if I told you about all the efforts to delay the mail, including literally dismantling 10 to 20% of mail sorting machines? What about in those emotionally charged days after the election, we have 300 tweets where he was amplifying falsehoods? A tornado of claims about voter fraud, all of which were shot down, disproven quite quickly. 61 out of 62 lawsuits that were shot down. The unprecedented pressure on state officials, including Trump voters, people who donated money to his own campaigns. But if I spent energy offering these facts, I think we all know what would happen. I would trigger strong emotions of agreement or disagreement. It wouldn't change anyone's existing belief, and it would fall on partisan lines. I wouldn't convince anyone I'm right. I wouldn't convince anyone that they're wrong. Because unfortunately, facts alone don't beat disinformation. So today I'm going to discuss why disinformation is so powerful and how we might innovate solutions. And I'm not saying that we don't have the debate or the discussion, because in fact, I'm saying this is absolutely urgent, because I'm deeply worried that disinformation is going to cause more violence in the country and is eroding our standing in a world that desperately needs American leadership. This is showing COVID deaths per million. So AverPoint, we generally stay out of politics. We're focused on COVID misinformation. And you can see, in my view, that's one reason explaining this huge discrepancy. The United States has 1,300 deaths per million people, and South Korea has 30 deaths per million people. And in my view, I mean, some people look at this and say, well, there's 5 countries that are doing worse than us out of 160. And my view is we should be looking at the countries that are doing the best. And the reason they're doing the best is because they base their societies around truth. And I also just want to dispel the argument that somehow our response led to better economic outcomes. And you can see the GDP changes over here as well. So we have to act if we want to remain leaders in the world. Now, at my company, AverPoint, we carved out a particular part of the problem, and we're working on a focused solution. This is too big a problem for one company to fix, but what we're tackling is the notion of credibility in digital content. So as you watch, listen to, or read digital content, we give you a social credibility layer that we hope signals trustworthiness on the digital Wild West. You can quickly understand if our community questions claims in the video, how topic experts reviewed those claims using transparent, balanced rules. But I'll focus on something bigger than a sales pitch, because we need many solutions. And I hope this might encourage some of you to think about other solutions or come work with me. Also, just a broader framework to innovate solutions to disinformation. And if you want the 30-second pitch, it's this. The typical innovation playbooks we use in startups are useful to find product market fit, but they aren't sufficient. If you were doing something else like in food or shipping or hotels, you could use the typical playbook, which is very hard. I'm not dismissing it by any means. It's prototyping an idea, testing for a market signal, raising capital, building a team, scaling your user base, maybe hopefully getting to an IPO and retiring on a yacht. But I can assure you that I'm not on a yacht. And this is much harder when it comes to disinformation. Because fundamentally, as Y Combinator says, most innovation, most Silicon Valley startups are just trying to make something people want. But disinformation is what people want. That's the problem. If someone's addicted to drugs, you can't show them a billboard for rehab and expect to solve the problem. You need to understand how they got there and harness a community effort that brings them back. More fundamentally, you need a community that doesn't want drugs in the first place. Today, we'll do 4 things. First, I'll argue that it's counterproductive. Well, it's not just counterproductive. It's insufficient to focus on today's politicians or today's technology. Social networks, filter bubbles, smartphones. We have to see today is just the most recent battle of an ancient war between truth and lies, and use history, especially the 20th century, to look for some patterns. Second, we'll look at psychology to understand how disinformation strikes the core of how all of us think. Third, we'll go back to history and understand how past societies have tailored solutions adapted to their unique social and technological context. And finally, I want to spend the last half, maybe last 20, 25 minutes doing an interactive session and use this framework grounded in history and psychology to think through solutions today. So let's start with definitions. Disinformation means using false information to achieve a political, business, or social goal. It's a subset of misinformation, which can be just an honest mistake. Disinformation is not an honest mistake. It's a lie or a half-truth with a purpose. Now, today it feels like this is a very 21st century problem. You can see here there's a phone and someone's liking good food, good friends, great laughs. And somehow this is turning into the whole world on fire. And we can feel very kind of trapped in the present. We've seen leaders around the world use this technology to spread disinformation on politics, coronavirus, the economy, and more. And there's a famous MIT study that I'm sure you've heard cited, which found they looked at every tweet ever made from the start of Twitter till 2016, and they found that lies were spreading 6 times faster than truths in every domain. But I think it's important that we look to history, because then it helps us understand that disinformation finds a way to strike every society's unique communications technologies and social context. The 20th century, of course, was the age of one-way television, radio, film, and mass printing. The tyrants of the last century, both on the left and the right, I want to be balanced here, used disinformation to shape minds and overwhelm internal and external enemies. Before Stalin, Mao, Hitler, and Mussolini became the evil villains we know in Hollywood movies and history books, they were young men who fostered the skill of information warfare. Stalin, of course, coined the word disinformation. Before Stalin became the Soviet dictator, he started his career as the editor of Pravda, the Soviet newspaper. His boldest use of information was the Great Purge, which, like QAnon or voter fraud, claimed to have uncovered a great conspiracy against the existing power base. He used this to justify imprisoning or killing 750,000 people, including a third of his own Communist Party members, most of his generals, scientists, intellectuals, and more. He would routinely edit out his enemies, as you can see in this picture, erasing them from the historical record. There was no truth in Stalin's eyes, just information, true or false, to achieve a goal. Now, we often think of Hitler as leading massive rallies of people mindlessly chanting his name. But long before that, after World War I, he was a young propagandist paid by the German military, learning how to use information to incite and control perhaps the world's most educated population. So those of you who think that disinformation only targets people who are stupid or dumb, it's not true at all. The most educated people in the world have been susceptible to this. In the 1920s and 30s, he exploited free speech, testing different techniques of false information to persuade people within a democratic Germany to voluntarily give him power. Like Stalin, he derived power largely by defining internal enemies, especially Jews and the media. While Stalin's enemies were not communist enough, Hitler's enemies were not German enough. Once in power, he promptly created a Ministry of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment. And we often think of German attacks starting with the Blitzkrieg, the famous German lightning strike tanks. But that's not true. His first attack was disinformation into a society that he was attacking, first creating the information chaos and reducing his enemies' internal solidarity. Propaganda was, of course, a central strategy of Mao Zedong, who killed more people than Stalin and Hitler. Before Mao became China's dictator in 1949, his jobs included writing for papers. He edited a liberal magazine, New Hunan. He also started a cultural book society that helped him learn how you propagate ideas. In 1965, after several years of failed policies, including the Great Famine, Mao started a purge similar to Stalin. He laid the blame on a great internal conspiracy of party members who were not pure enough. He encouraged this conspiracy among young people, leading to the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Classes were canceled, universities shut down, mass rallies emerged, chanting against party leaders who were deemed not to be communist enough. It led to a decade of violence where millions were persecuted and perhaps over 1 million died. So this is all to say disinformation was a central strategy of the most oppressive regimes of the past century. And we certainly have to be vigilant against this kind of information warfare. But these extreme examples can sometimes obscure its use in all societies, even our own. The yellow journalism of the early 20th century, the lead up to the Civil War, even America's first contested elections, where pamphlets terrified voters of the other party. In 1800, Federalist women were so scared of the free-thinking Thomas Jefferson that they literally hid their Bibles in wells. You can look into any country, form a government at any time and find examples of information warfare. And it's sometimes hard to see it in our own. You can even go back to the ancient days. In Virgil's Aeneid, the epic poem about the founding of the Roman tribe, he called rumor the swiftest of all evils. It incites wars, family violence, and the collapse of cities. And even the most powerful humans, the most powerful warriors and kings are powerless to stop it. And in an added twist, the Aeneid itself was an eloquent work of disinformation. The Caesars had just become dictators of the new Roman Empire, ending 500 years of the Roman Republic. The Emperor Augustus commissioned Virgil to write an epic poem to legitimize empire to a people whose history and identity prized freedom and self-rule. If you want a warning sign for Americans today. So all this is to underscore a point. The Capitol riots were not a unique triumph of disinformation. The disinformation we see today has in some form always inflicted humanity. So the question is not why it works today. The question is, why does it work always? Because it exploits weaknesses in the human brain that block our humanity, our reason, and our ability to see the truth. Instead of the truth, we believe what we want to believe, or what someone else wants us to believe. I'll discuss 3 specific flaws in the human brain: amygdala hijack, confirmation bias, and tribalism. Now, over the last decade or so, we've kind of popularized the notion of the fast brain and the slow brain, the 2 different ways that humans think. The slow brain is this, the cerebral cortex. It's where we think, analyze, do math, use logic. It's how we reason our way to truth. It's unique to humans. Now, the fast brain is this P-shaped thing here, the amygdala. This is more primitive. We share this with animals. It interprets the things we see, hear, touch, taste, etc. It decodes our senses using simple memories and stereotypes that are encoded here, our hippocampus, the memory part of our brain. So the amygdala can turn a simple sense into a vivid emotion that's been learned over time. The sight of a warm fire, the smell of fresh baked cookies, the sound of rainfall, all of these are probably evoking feelings in you, perhaps of joy, of loss, of hope, maybe even of hate. The amygdala is your brain's gatekeeper. If it senses something scary, the stress takes over and moves us to safety. It hijacks the slow brain. It stops things that are scary. And it lets in things that it thinks are good. It lets in the sight of babies, of food, of beautiful people, of symbols that we've recognized and understand. And sometimes this is good. When you touch a hot stove or see an angry tiger, you don't have time to pause, crunch the numbers, weigh the pros and cons. You have to act. But sometimes it's bad. If you've learned to fear Black people or police officers and see one, the amygdala releases fear and makes it hard for you to pause and understand the situation. It's why DNA evidence has found so many eyewitnesses got the wrong guy. It's why scientific studies show that if you slightly tint Obama's skin color, a certain group of people would just trust him less no matter what was being said. The amygdala blocks complexity. This is perhaps the most infamous PowerPoint slide in the world. It was made before the Challenger space shuttle launched in 1987. And it's somewhere in here. I can't make sense of what this is saying. It lists the risks to the shuttle. And if people had understood this, they may not have launched it. But even the rocket scientists at NASA looked at this slide and their amygdala was so scared, they didn't read it. And instead of removing danger, they killed 7 people. So the amygdala can do the wrong thing. Now, this is just a bad PowerPoint slide. But what happens, what does this have to do with disinformation? Because disinformation doesn't want us to analyze, think, weigh good and bad, and get to the right answer. It triggers our primitive brain. It paralyzes our human brain. It wants to reduce us to a simpler state where the disinformant can tell us what to think. Now, disinformation exploits a second weakness, confirmation bias. Once we have a belief, we seek out information that proves it. When confronted with opposing information, what do? We ignore it, we deny it, we rationalize it. Let's say you're conditioned to seeing circles and I'm conditioned to seeing squares. These are the same set of dots, but you will see a square and I will see a circle, or other way around. Today there's a lot of talk of filter bubbles. With so many sources, it's easy to wall ourselves into a news source and friend circle that just reinforces our beliefs. And this is a big problem in our society. But the problem's even worse. Even if we are exposed to all the facts, all the same facts, we'll see what our bias wants us to see. So how does disinformation use confirmation bias? Well, in 2 ways. In the long term, it tries to create the pattern on you. Through repetition and by triggering the amygdala, it tries to plant an emotional memory. It triggers your hopes and fears, and in that emotional state, it shows you a pattern. And that pattern gets lodged into your hippocampus. Next time you see that image, the pattern will reemerge. In the long run, this can be a good thing. It's the basis of how governments and religions teach young people, pattern good things into their brains. But it can also be used the wrong way to brainwash people. Now, in the short term, you can't create these patterns in people's minds very quickly. So disinformation tries to understand our existing bias and associate with it. If they figure out you like circles, it feeds you circles linked with their message. Today's machine learning algorithms and cheap databases mean it's possible to quickly figure out what patterns in almost every one of the 8 billion minds in the world. If you remember the 2016 election, bipartisan investigations uncovered that these Russian troll farms were understanding what triggered people and sending them messages that would, what patterns were in people's heads, and would send them messages that would resonate. If you love Jesus, they might send you this message. If you were scared of police officers, they might send you this message. And this was all done to divide the American people. So disinformation triggers a third, or targets a third weakness in the human brain, tribalism. We sometimes forget that two-legged ancestors have roamed the earth for perhaps 6 million years. Modern humans may have been around for as long as 200,000 years. And the archaeological record shows that we've only lived in civilization for at most 4,000 or 5,000 years. So 97 to 99.9999% of the time, we've been living in tribes, hunter-gatherers. And we survived if we stuck with the tribe, if we protected our children, obeyed the tribal customs, obeyed the tribal leader. Imagine if the tribe did something wrong, like massacre the neighboring tribe. We could have protested. We could have left the tribe and been, an activist. We could have maybe lasted one generation in the Wild West, but eventually we'd die out, unless we could form our own tribe that believed in our views. So we are essentially tribal. Tribalism affects our ability to reason. Once people are loyal to a group, they will do everything they can to rationalize the group's position. This is called motivated reasoning. It's kind of a spin on confirmation bias. So how does this affect disinformation? Well, if you can build someone's loyalty to the team, and that could be a political party, it could be a social group, it could be a race, it could be a religion, anything. But once you build that team loyalty, they will go out of their way to support the team. And education doesn't make you better. So Dan Kahan, famous political psychologist at Yale, he did this study where he showed this intentionally complicated graph. Don't even try to understand what the graph is saying. And he also, he found a bunch of respondents, and he measured the respondents based on their numeracy, how good they are at analyzing numbers, interpreting numbers. So in this first graph, this is about skin cream. Is a certain skin cream making a rash get better? And as you can expect, whether you're a liberal Democrat or a conservative Republican, as your numeracy improved, you answered the question correctly. He then repeated this experiment, but he changed the labels to gun control. Same graph, just changed the labels. And then he, again, had a bunch of people try to interpret the numbers based on their numeracy. When you ask this partisan question, the better your numeracy, the more likely you are to just somehow justify your partisan position. Intelligence, education, all this hard work in developing your mind didn't help you actually get to the truth. It just helped you find clever ways to rationalize what your party is saying. Now, I may sound like a pessimist, but I'm not. Our human brains have the ability to form ideas with facts, logic, and honest debate. I firmly believe that. But what I'm saying is disinformation strategically paralyzes this human ability. If you're an optimist, you have to have your eyes open and understand this. Disinformation is not doing this by accident. It has a motive, usually power or money, not a higher truth. So, we look around, we all have pretty good lives. We live in a nice country. We get to go to school, we get to develop our minds, we get to watch Netflix. Society has gotten to space. They've built the internet. There's lots of good happening. We're eradicating diseases. How have societies functioned at all if what I'm saying is true? Well, each society in its time has figured out some way to stop disinformation. The combination of its unique technology and its unique social context produced its unique solutions. So some things that have been done since ancient times. Somehow, when tigers weren't attacking them, people figured out some truths using their slow brains, using their human brains, and they encoded this into scripture, into mythology, into norms, into customs, into something that the fast brain could see and simply make a quick choice. When you're hungry, you don't analyze the pros and cons of robbing a store. You've learned through words that you believe are divine, through norms that you accept, that is not the right thing to do. Another way is relying on learned wise men who can protect society from disinformation. Most people don't have the space to sit around and think slowly, but this special class is given that space. They're trained to think through years of study and meditation. They memorize the laws of the tribe and the accumulated wisdom of ancestors. They get space from the day-to-day gossip, the day-to-day street fight. If they have credibility with rulers and the people, the rulers and people may defer to their wisdom to answer tough questions. And then there's a more blunt way to stop disinformation. A society can censor or restrict ideas it deems to be bad. This evokes images of totalitarian states of the 20th century or modern autocracies. But it happens in free states. In America, the government won't let you advertise cigarettes to teenagers or urge an angry crowd to commit an imminent violent action. The government does allow you to use hate speech, but universities, nonprofits, and private businesses like social media platforms currently have the right to restrict its use within their physical and digital spaces. But all of this, encoded symbols, select wise men, and censorship in some form, assumes a society knows the truth. It restricts free speech, free thinking, and progress to truth. So, has a society ever tried to build a country that wasn't based on the truth it already had, but created space for others to find truth? How have societies stopped disinformation while preserving freedom? Well, we're lucky enough to say that our country was the first that tried to do that. Our founding fathers were men of the Enlightenment, a movement that believed through science and learning, societies could move towards universal truth. In the decade between the Revolutionary War and the ratification of the Constitution, they experimented with different types of state republics. They studied different experiments in self-rule, especially ancient Greece and Rome. And they would soon observe the violent French Revolution's guillotine spilling blood at the center of Europe's Enlightenment. They quickly understood freedom gained through a revolution was quickly lost. Free people were vulnerable to the rousing words of a charismatic dictator. A dictator could use the form of free speech to trigger the impulses of the people. Democracy can quickly turn into tyranny. Their challenge was not just to gain liberty, which they had done. It was to preserve liberty, to create the space for free men and women to find the truth and resist the impulse to believe disinformation. Now, they didn't have the discipline of psychology, but understood humans were a mix of passion and reason. Their innovation was in a system of government that could withstand the flaws in human nature. Or their innovation was a system of government that could withstand the flaws of human nature. The separation of power, 3 branches of government and divisions between federal and state, that was first innovation. Number 2 were staggered elections. The House, Senate, President, and courts represent different snapshots in time. A disinformation campaign would have to trigger people for 6 years to take hold of the Senate, for decades to take over the courts. In that time, the slow brain would evaluate if the impulsive message is good, filter it, hopefully correct it. The third innovation was just a big republic. Madison observed that if you could spread a republic over a large amount of space, no single faction, no regional faction would let its tribal impulses take over. For that republic to function, ideas would get filtered and become more universal and less tribal. And the fourth idea, maybe the one that's most optimistic, is from Jefferson: mass public education. He imagined a society of enlightened, educated citizens debating themselves with evidence and logic, perfecting their information. He said the truth belongs to the living. Can you think of a society where a founding father thought that? So we're lucky, and we should honor that. Now, let's fast forward to another period where Americans had to deal with this question. How do you preserve freedom while dealing with disinformation? I'm talking about the first half of the 20th century. You saw the rise of yellow journalism. Much like the internet today, there were newspapers everywhere, and they were all competing to trigger with headlines different groups of audiences, telling each audience what it wanted to hear, crafting a individual reality for each individual group. There was the rise of overcrowded cities. There was mass immigration from Ireland, from Italy, from Eastern Europe, bringing people with different languages, customs, different forms of Christianity that had to integrate into society. There were changing views on gender. There was a diverse economy. We went from 97% farmers in 1776 to a growing diverse economy that pumped oil, that created cars, that processed food. There was a feeling that all these different groups in society had their own reality. Not everyone was a farmer. Not everyone understood what everyone else did. So these groups were in constant conflict. Immigrants and native-born, management and labor. Of course, there were horrible race wars. And then there was, of course, nationalism. The two world wars that resulted in tens of millions of deaths. Now, the big thinkers at the time looked at all this chaos and they started to develop the discipline of psychology. Freud introduced the idea of our unconscious desires, especially violence and sex, that drive most of our actions. Our unconscious mind just kind of rationalizes what our conscious mind just rationalizes what our unconscious mind wants. We are rarely rational beings evaluating facts and seeking truth. Gustave Le Bon traveled the world studying crowds and observed that when people form in groups, they lose their individual mind and form a more primitive group mind. This mob mind doesn't reason and use logic, but it's more of a collective fast brain that makes brute decisions about good and bad. He suggested, whether left wing or right wing, the mob is essentially conservative. And he himself was a conservative. But he observed that once the mob destroys existing authority, it almost always responds to a powerful tribal leader. It's why the French, Russian, Chinese, and Cuban revolutions started off left-wing, but ended up in obedient, militarized autocracies. Edward Bernays, so then I was inside these two thinkers, you could think of as the applied thinkers of these intellectuals. Edward Bernays was Freud's nephew, and he's called the father of public relations. Walter Lippmann is called the father of modern journalism. So they took these ideas of individual and crowd psychology and applied them to the problems of the day. They thought that society was too complicated. It's too hard to understand what each part of the economy, what different racial groups, what different political groups are all thinking. So it was too easy to hijack the brain and with its unconscious desires. So they came up with two solutions. First was a neutral factual layer of experts who could filter information for non-experts. Each group would have its own kind of PR function that would simplify its very complicated technical knowledge for the rest of the world. Now, I'm not an economist, but I can look at this graph and figure out what it's saying about quarterly gross domestic product in the US. That's because the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is filled with PhDs who are much smarter than I am, analyzing the numbers and figuring out what the GDP number is, and they take all their calculus and crazy equations and they put out a graph that all of us non-experts can understand. Now, this basic function is done by lots of different groups within society. And they help us understand their very highly specialized knowledge. Now, so this is kind of saying, okay, one way we can deal with the complexity of modern society is help each person's slow brain understand in simple terms what the different groups are doing. But how do you handle the unconscious desires of the brain that are always wanting sex and violence and seem to always lead to world war? Well, for this, they did something that's much more controversial. They argued that we have to associate the underlying urges, especially for violence and sex, with consumer products. If the other option is World War III, it's better that people are made to want cars and keep everyone employed. This was the 20th century solution to the brain's weaknesses: to entrust the world's information to professional, neutral experts who would give us real information we could process with our slow brains, and PR that would channel our violent urges to more productive pursuits. President Herbert Hoover was speaking to a group of advertisers and public relations experts, and he has this famous quote: "You have taken over the job of creating desire and have transformed people into constantly moving happiness machines, machines which have become the key to economic progress." This is quite this is not Thomas Jefferson thinking of us as individuals who are using our minds to pursue our own happiness, form our own opinions. But this was how the 20th century dealt with all the chaos that they were seeing. Now, the 20th century gatekeepers, they did great things. Look at life expectancy since they got in charge. Went from like 30 or 40 to over 80 in many parts of the world, close to 70 in even the most developing parts of the world. The bureaucracies of the US and the Soviet Union prevented a World War III. They eradicated diseases. They educated billions of people, lifted billions out of poverty. It was the fastest pace of learning the world has ever seen. The unprecedented exchange of people, cultures, and religions. But today, this notion of elite gatekeepers of information has fallen out of favor. You often hear people on the left and the right talking about the self-dealing of these elite technocrats. Weapons of mass destruction, scandals among priests and yoga teachers, media bias, subprime mortgage brokers, bailouts for Wall Street bankers the year that they collapsed the world economy, big tech. These are all phrases I could say, and they would trigger a lot of anger in a lot of people. And what it's done is overall, it's lost faith in the big institutions that used to filter our information: media, business, government, religion. Meanwhile, the internet's just broken their filters. Even if we did trust them, the internet's broken their monopoly on information and desire. Anyone can say anything to anyone. There's no filter for truth, expertise, or sources. We have analytics to figure out what you want, what will trigger you to open, click, read, and believe. And we have messaging tools that can send you emails, web notifications, mobile notifications, and adjust them to maximize our success. So what do we do about all this? My main argument is that today's disinformation is just the 21st century's incarnation of an ancient battle. Every society has to decide how it will prevent false information from blocking its path to truth. So I want to now do an interactive portion. I think we have 20 minutes left. So I have 3 questions. The questions are: how is today's battle against disinformation similar to past battles? Then, how is it unique? How is it unlike past battles? Now, if you think about that a little bit, I want us to think through, from some of the techniques I talked about, from ancient days and the more modern American context, what are some techniques that resonated with you? What are some of the ways that you think these techniques could be digitized and made relevant and maybe lead to solutions today? So I know there's, it looks like there's a bunch of people on the Zoom. I think just maybe the best way to do this is let's just break for 2 minutes. If everyone can just kind of think of their answer to these, this question and just send it in through the chat. Matthew, does that work?
That works, yes, sir.
Okay, so yeah, let's just take 2 minutes and send your answer to this first question. All right. Anyone else want to send in comments over the chat? Okay. Okay. So Matthew, Raul, Anna, send in answers. Okay. So I'll start reading some of these answers, and then we can come back to Carl's more general criticism later. So Matthew's saying, look, disinformation today and compared to the past, it's similar that it's designed to damage what would otherwise be considered trusted institutions, the media, government agencies, et cetera. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth there. So once there's a kind of a way of knowing, a way of accepting information, it's hard if that way of knowing information is kind of outside a certain actor's ability to win, they might consider disinformation as their best path to power. Rather than win the debate, they can take down the method of information. So Raul says, in essence, it's the same. That is, agenda-driven influencers trying to trigger emotions to get support to take an action. And yeah, I think what the triggers are, depend. If you're in a society where all you have are smoke signals and verbal communication, people are going to try to rile you up, trigger your emotions, and go through every form of communication after that. Writing, the telegraph, the telephone, et cetera, all the way to the smartphone. So yeah, absolutely. Then Anna writes, today's battles are similar because we have to fight against charismatic leaders who spread rhetoric and disinformation and encourage fanatic followers rather than free thinkers. And yeah, I think that's the 20th century examples are the most dramatic, where it was these very charismatic leaders who did that. And I think that's absolutely true that today we're seeing autocrats do that and use today's technologies to do that everywhere. And I think the only thing I'd add to that is it's hard to sometimes miss it happening in more subtle ways, moderate ways that are maybe less, that seem less dangerous. But I think it's still important to understand it when it's not even from the most charismatic source. And sometimes you might even argue it's ethical to do, like when the Allies used some disinformation tactics on the Germans. There's some funny stories about, you might want to read about kind of fake radio stations that were set up, et cetera. And that's a whole another ethical question. But yes, charismatic leaders are something that we're seeing a lot of today. And often in free societies that are shifting kind of more towards autocracy. So I'll read a few more of these. So similar to previous years, people are tribal, but today's tribes can be enabled by the internet to be global. That's a very interesting point. People have always been tribal in some way or the other. Now we can form these global tribes around the internet. So transnational tribes that may not have formed in the 1800s, when you could meet people in your neighborhood, maybe even in your nation, but it was harder to get across the globe. And then some of you talked about the speed of disinformation. So thank you so much for those answers. Now I just want to, if anyone, I'm sure while you're thinking about the first question, you probably thought of, what's unique to our current social context and technology. You've already answered this question. I mean, people have talked about speed and the global nature of things, but does anyone want to add anything more here? Just take a minute. So just to keep going, I would say, yeah, I mean, for this, it's obviously our technology is unique to our time. You didn't have these 50 years ago, 2,000 years ago, smartphones, social networks, analytics to understand biases, tools to trigger each bias. to rapidly increase and understand the rapidly increasing understanding of the human brain. There's just hundreds of millions of dollars of government grant money going to studying the brain, billions of dollars of capital turning that into applied products. And then the context, you guys have talked about the global nature. I've talked about the declining institutions. We didn't talk as much about isolation. So while we're global, there's a lot more isolation as people have lost their traditional sense of community, religion, et cetera. Maybe where there's some hope, you could see while we've lost trust in top-down institutions, there is more trust in peers, reviews, authenticity. So I think these are all some unique things about today that we should think about. Now I just wanted to put these up. These are some of the techniques that past societies have used to manage the fast brain, to manage the triggers on the disinformation triggers. Not all these make sense in a free society. Some of them were developed specifically for a free society, like the founding fathers. So I wanted you guys to just kind of take a minute and kind of answer the question, what tactics from the past work in today's context? Which of these really resonate with you? Like if you were going to start a company or a nonprofit, or if you were working in a government agency thinking about this, like which of these would you gravitate towards, given everything you've seen in society, technology, today's standards of ethics? So Ariane writes really long debates on podcasts as a strategy, and I think I know what you're saying. The kind of deeper conversations, more nuanced debate. Podcasts are a place where you see more of that, longer conversations. Sarah says, utilizing public education resources to teach children skills for identifying credible versus non-credible information. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of work happening around critical thinking and teaching young people, even as young as 5th grade, 6th grade, teaching them to look for sources when they look on the internet. Instead of giving them a textbook, giving them a browser and seeing if they can detect good information from bad information. And what is both hopeful and kind of disappointing is there are studies that show PhDs who are like my age or older are more susceptible to misinformation and disinformation than like teenagers, because our ways of thinking, we're not as used to this happening. And so we've kind of formed our ways of thinking. Our patterns are harder to break. So I would add to Sarah, to your comment, not just to teaching children, but also to adults. So if someone came up with a company that figured that out, I think you'd have a lot of impact. Carl writes, you don't have book bans burning on the list. This is going on now with publisher boycotts and shutting off people's social media. So I think Carl's saying, yes, I mean, there's the question of censorship is obviously a topic of the day. Trump was booted off Twitter. There've been lots of, or Parler was shut down by, they were booted off the app stores, and then even the infrastructure services like AWS. So this is a question. I think, Carl, from your language, I think you're offering a very like open view of free speech, just kind of let everyone say anything, that I think is not taking into account what I've been talking about, the fast brain triggers that are so easy to manipulate. We can disagree on that, but I think the unregulated free speech, completely unregulated free speech, is not what our founders envisioned, and it is a gray area. So I think to call any type of discussion around it censorship is unproductive. And I think we should all be thinking, what is the gray area? What's the right way to do this? How do we give people the freedom to talk, the freedom to discuss ideas, and improve together as a society? And I think where I might agree with you is that I think regulation and censorship is a blunt instrument and can easily go wrong. And it's kind of like an emergency measure that you ideally don't want to use. Like it was used with vaping and teenagers kind of at the last resort. But ideally you want to find other ways to do it. So Matthew, you're right, regulation, especially in the tech industry, that's obviously a big topic. Do you regulate what features they use? What's interesting is some of the same people who are advocating, who are kind of making the loudest sounds about censorship, are advocating blocking tech companies from using certain features like infinite scroll and notifications. And I think those are all interesting discussions of, if we figured out a technology that could somehow, like imagine there was a button you could click and somehow just incite someone to commit violence. Should that be regulated? Well, obviously that probably should, but something like infinite scroll, just kind of, it's called doom scrolling on your phone. Should that be regulated, or should we find other ways to help people not get sucked into that? Okay, separation of powers and regulation has a good chance to be effective, Victoria. And I think certainly the separation of powers, in the broadest sense, that's true. I think the regulation, this is where there's controversy. I think there's a lot of folks on the conservative side who think there's too much regulation, there's too much executive authority that can be used without legislation to regulate business speech, commercial speech. The FCC has a lot of regulatory power over our airwaves. So a lot of the debates happening at that level, like how much regulation should you use, and should that be done by Congress or by the executive branch? So if you're interested in that, I would encourage looking at some of the FCC debates, which normally are not interesting reading for people. But if you're a regulatory person, there's both sides have some pretty interesting arguments there. Bradley writes, from a psychology perspective, the issue with speed is arguably in the individual mind and related busy lifestyle. Mind works lightning fast. Tactics from the past involve living with very little and not being defined by what we have. Yeah, so I think, Bradley, if I understand your comment, yeah, it's the speed of, the problem is with our fast brain, this lizard brain, reptile brain, and the technologies today can trigger that in ways that even newspapers and telegraphs couldn't. And I think I would agree that if there was one feature of today's technology that's really affected all this, it's just the speed with which it can give us information that can just take over the amygdala. Okay, so yeah, Carl, you sent a few more comments, and I'd love to talk to you maybe individually after this, but we do have 5 minutes left. One of Carl's comments was, this happens a lot. He kind of said, I was being Orwellian in some of my comments. And it's funny how Orwell is someone both sides use to attack the other side. I would encourage all of you to read an essay by Orwell called Notes on Nationalism. And one of the things he says is, it's almost impossible to have an opinion on anything without introducing some of your own bias into it. And maybe the way we should think about, I mean, if you're going to be passionate enough to like go deep on something, you're going to form an opinion. It's almost impossible not to. What we should start thinking about are ways to detect our own biases, and that maybe that way, on both sides of the aisle in politics, across industries that conflict with each other, competitors in the same industry that are fighting each other. Maybe we'll have less conflict as we start to kind of peel back some of these confirmation biases. So notes on nationalism is kind of my response to the charge of being Orwellian. So let me end with hopefully something a little more optimistic. Which is that, we are lucky to live, we're lucky to live in a country whose purpose was to give each living generation space to debate, think, and get to truth. As Americans, I think we sometimes kind of forget that. There's kind of this, sometimes a very like jingoistic patriotism, which doesn't really think about our intellectual history. And then sometimes there's a very critical view of our founders. But I think this is the key thing. We were given the space to get better through debate, through thinking, through reason, strategies to keep any tyrant from taking over one branch of government. But that is a constant battle to keep that going. As I've tried to argue, it's gone on since ancient days. It will go on as long as we don't blow all of each other up. So, in the 21st century, it's up to us to preserve freedom while defending against disinformation. If we don't rise to the moment, history does tell us some kind of orthodoxy, left or right, will impose its order on us. I think it's shallow to talk about some unrestricted free speech. I think there's enough examples that doesn't work. I think you're insane if you think that Parler is the answer and going to somehow save society. But that's my own view. My view is we need a sustainable form of free speech that survives the animal brain. It doesn't necessarily have to censor or squash it, but it has to somehow survive it. And I've presented 8 or 9 techniques people have tried since ancient days to do that. If we creatively learn from the past, innovate our own answers, maybe the human brain can prevail. Because if we don't, some orthodoxy left or right will eventually take over. So I'll end with this kind of warning from Bob Dylan. At some point the saints are coming through, and if that happens, it's all over. So with that, I wish you guys luck. We need your optimism, your youth, your energy to solve this problem. And if anyone, I'm sticking around if anyone has time, to ask questions. Matthew, you could give them my email if anyone wants to email me. If you are particularly curious about AverPoint, of course, that's my day job when I'm not pontificating. So if you're interested in working, doing some type of work at a startup, shoot me a note. And I'll end with that.